They don't tell you about the ash when they ship you out. The recruitment posters show guardsmen standing triumphant against orange skies, lasguns raised, the Emperor's aquila blazing on their chests. They show glory. They show purpose. They never show you the ash that gets into everything: your lungs, your eyes, the mechanisms of your weapon, the folds of your skin, the spaces between your teeth. They never tell you that you'll be tasting the incinerated remains of 7 decades of warfare with every meal, every breath, every moment of your miserable existence on this throne-forsaken rock. I've been here for 3 years now. 3 years that feel like 30. 3 years since I stepped off the transport at Hive in Furnace and realized that the hell I'd been assigned to wasn't metaphorical. The heat hits you first, a physical wall of it that makes you stagger even in your flak armor. Then comes the smell: burned metal, chemical residue, and something organic that's been cooking for so long you can't identify what it used to be. And beneath it all, that constant taste of ash, grinding, persistent, inescapable. My name is Trupavenko Maras, or at least that's what my identification tags claim. Sometimes I wonder if I'm still that person, the kid from the Hive world of Mordessa who thought enlisting was his ticket to something better than the manufactorum floor. Most days I think that version of me died in the first week, burned away like everything else on this planet. What's left is something harder, grimmer, hollowed out by the constant grind of survival in a war that has no end. We're stationed at Firebase Gehenna, one of thousands of identical fortifications scattered across the ash wastes of the Armageddon sector. Our sector, they tell us, as if any of this dead ground matters, as if holding this particular stretch of carbonized earth against the greenskin hordes makes any difference in a conflict that's been raging since before my grandfather was born. But we hold it anyway, because that's what the Imperium demands. We hold it because the alternative is execution for desertion, and because somewhere in the twisted logic of the Munitorum, our lives are more expendable here than anywhere else in the galaxy. The Firebase itself is a monument to imperial efficiency, which is to say, it's brutal, functional, and utterly indifferent to human comfort. Rockcrete walls 30 meters high, topped with razor wire and automated gun servitors that track anything that moves. Inside, we have barracks that house 200 men in a space designed for 50, a commissariat office that nobody enters willingly, a chapel where preacher Mordus delivers sermons about glorious sacrifice 3 times daily, and an armory that's always one requisition form away from leaving us with nothing but bayonets and prayers. The whole structure is painted the color of dried blood, though whether that's intentional or just decades of rust, nobody can say. I'm writing this in the brief hours before dawn, the only time when the heat drops below lethal and the constant artillery barrage from the front lines pauses long enough to think. My hands shake as I mark these words in a journal I keep hidden in my footlocker, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the ash. I don't know why I'm documenting this, maybe because I need to believe that someone, somewhere, will read this and understand what we endured. Maybe because the act of writing makes me feel human again, reminds me that I once had thoughts beyond where my next meal is coming from and whether the greenskins will breach the walls tonight. Or maybe, and this is the thought that haunts me in the darkest hours, I'm writing this as evidence. Evidence of what they did to us, what they're still doing. It started 3 months ago, though I didn't realize it at the time. Command sent down new orders through the usual channels, a memorandum stamped with the seal of some distant Munitorum bureaucrat who'd never set foot on Armageddon and never would. The language was typical Imperial boilerplate, dense with official terminology that obscured more than it revealed. New deployment protocols, enhanced efficiency measures, optimized resource allocation. The kind of phrases that sound reasonable on paper and mean absolutely nothing until you see them implemented. The first change was the ration schedule. We'd always been on tight supplies. This is Armageddon, after all, where every calorie has to be shipped in through contested space and distributed across millions of guardsmen. But the new schedule cut our daily intake by 30%. When Sergeant Callow questioned the reduction, pointing out that men can't fight on empty stomachs. The commissariat officer simply cited Regulation 974 Alpha and reminded us that questioning supply allocations was tantamount to questioning the Emperor's wisdom. 2 days later, Callow disappeared during a routine patrol. His body was never recovered, though we all knew he'd never left the firebase. The second change was the casualty replacement protocol. Before, when we lost men in combat, we'd get replacements from the transit camps near the hive cities, fresh recruits, terrified and useless, but at least warm bodies to fill the gaps in our lines. After the new orders came down, the replacements stopped coming. We went from 200 men to 180, then 160, then 140. Our combat effectiveness dropped accordingly, but command didn't seem concerned. When we requested reinforcements, we received a terse response. Maintain position with available personnel. The Emperor protects. The third change was the most subtle and the most disturbing. Our assignment duration, previously listed as indefinite pending rotation, was quietly amended to permanent posting. I found the change buried in a supply manifest, a single line of text that redefined our entire existence. We weren't guardsmen doing our tours and hoping for eventual transfer. We were permanent fixtures of Firebase Gehenna, assigned here until death or total incapacitation made us worthless even by Imperial standards. I should have understood then what was happening. I should have seen the pattern. But I was too busy surviving, too focused on the immediate threats, the orc raids, the ash storms, the equipment failures, the daily struggle to maintain weapons and armor in conditions that corroded metal faster than we could clean it. I didn't have the perspective to step back and see the larger picture. None of us did. It was Trooper Lessig who first voiced the suspicion that had been growing in all our minds. We were in the barracks during the midday lull, too hot to move, too exhausted to sleep. The air conditioning had failed again. It failed more often than it worked, and we lay in our bunks like corpses in a mass grave, waiting for the temperature to drop enough to function. "Have you noticed," Lessig said to the darkness, "that they've stopped giving us mission objectives?" The question hung in the stifling air. I thought about our recent operations: patrol the perimeter, reinforce Sector 7, clear the approach trench, hold the eastern watchtower. All defensive, all reactive. Nothing that advanced any strategic goal or moved us closer to any kind of victory. "We're holding the line," someone muttered. "That's the objective." "But holding it for what?" Lessig pressed. "Holding it until when? We're not pushing forward. We're not being rotated out. We're just here, dying slowly." "Shut your mouth," Corporal then snapped. "You want the commissar to hear that kind of talk?" But Lessig had planted the seed, and it grew in the silence that followed. We all started paying attention to things we'd previously ignored. The supplies that arrived were exactly enough to keep us functional, but never enough to improve our situation. The intelligence briefings that told us nothing useful about enemy movements or strategic developments, the communications blackouts that seemed to happen whenever we tried to contact higher command with anything other than routine status reports. The way our sector seemed increasingly isolated from the larger war effort, as if we were being quietly forgotten, or quarantined. The 4th month brought the medical inspections. A team of Medicae personnel arrived from Hive Infernus, accompanied by an Adeptus Administratum official whose augmetic eyes clicked and whirred as they scanned us. They went through the firebase systematically, examining every guardsman, checking our vitals, taking blood samples, asking questions about our health and combat readiness. The process took 2 weeks, during which our defensive patrols were suspended and we were confined to the firebase. When they left, they took 30 men with them. Men who'd been judged unsuitable for continued service. We never saw them again. No reassignments, no medical discharges. They simply vanished into the Imperium's vast bureaucratic machinery, and we were told not to discuss their departure. The remaining men, 110 of us now, were issued new identification tags. The metal felt different, heavier somehow. On the back, Stamped in tiny characters was a designation I didn't recognize. CCPROTOCOLACTIVE. When I asked Medike Veskin what it meant, she looked at me with an expression I couldn't read and told me it was just an administrative code. Nothing to concern myself with, but I was concerned. We all were. The Firebase had taken on a different atmosphere, something beyond the usual grim determination. There was a sense of abandonment, of being cut loose from the structures that had defined our military existence. We still followed orders, still maintained discipline, still fought when the greenskins came, but beneath it all was a growing realization that we weren't fighting for victory anymore. We were fighting because fighting was all we had left. The greenskin attacks increased in frequency and ferocity. They came in waves now, crude assaults that seemed designed more to test our defenses than to break them. We'd repel them, count our casualties, and wait for the next wave. The pattern was monotonous, grinding, a cycle of violence that had no resolution. Men died. We burned the bodies. The ash added their remains to the omnipresent grey snow that covered everything. I started having dreams. Not nightmares exactly, though they were disturbing enough. In the dreams, I was watching Firebase Gehenna from above, seeing it as the single point in an enormous landscape of ash and ruin. And as I watched, I realized the Firebase wasn't a fortress. It was a cage. And we weren't soldiers. We were specimens, test subjects, in an experiment we couldn't comprehend. I woke from these dreams tasting metal, my heart racing, convinced that something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of our situation. But in the harsh light of day, with the heat bearing down and the routine of military life demanding attention, the dreams seemed like paranoid fantasies brought on by stress and malnutrition. I pushed them aside and focused on survival. Then came the incident with Trooper Vrel. Vrel had been with the unit since before my arrival, a veteran of countless engagements who'd somehow survived when so many others had fallen. He was quiet, competent, the kind of soldier who did his job without complaint and never drew attention from the commissariat. We'd served together on dozens of patrols, and I trusted him with my life. So when he started talking about the walls, I listened. "They're moving," he told me one night on watch, his voice barely audible over the wind. "The walls, I've been measuring them." I looked at the massive rockcrete barriers that surrounded us, solid and unchanging as far as I could tell. "What do you mean, moving?" "Getting closer," he said, "inch by inch. Every week, the perimeter shrinks. We have less space than we did 6 months ago." I wanted to tell him he was imagining things, that the stress had gotten to him. But something in his tone stopped me. Vrel wasn't prone to delusions. If he said the walls were moving, he had reasons for believing it. "Why would they do that?" I asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I've been keeping measurements. Check for yourself if you don't believe me." I did check. Over the following weeks, I made my own measurements, using the standard issue entrenching tool as a gauge. And Emperor helped me. Vrel was right. The walls were contracting. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but definitely contracting. The firebase was getting smaller. When I brought this to Sergeant Ralvan's attention, he told me to forget about it. "Maintenance crews make adjustments all the time," he said, though he couldn't meet my eyes. "Don't read too much into it." But I couldn't forget, because if the walls were moving, if our space was being deliberately reduced, that meant someone was implementing a plan. Someone had decided that we needed less room. Someone was managing our slow contraction, our gradual compression into an ever smaller area. Someone was conducting an experiment. The realization crystallized one night during an ash storm. These storms are common on Armageddon. Massive walls of particulate matter driven by superheated winds that can strip flesh from bone if you're caught outside without protection. We'd sealed ourselves in the barracks, emergency shutters drawn, while the storm raged around us. The sound was deafening, a constant roar like the world itself was being ground to dust. In that darkness, pressed together in the stifling heat, I finally understood what was happening to us. Firebase Gehenna wasn't a military installation. It was a laboratory, and we were the subjects. The Imperium had sent us here not to fight, but to be studied, to see how long human beings could endure in the most hostile conditions imaginable, to test the limits of what Guardsmen could tolerate before breaking completely. Our rations were reduced to determine minimum caloric requirements. Our space was contracted to measure the effects of confinement. Our rotation was cancelled to observe long-term psychological deterioration. Our combat engagements were staged to assess performance under sustained stress. We weren't soldiers anymore. We were data points in some vast administratum study, filed away in the endless archives of the Imperium's bureaucratic machinery. Our suffering had been codified, quantified, transformed into statistics that would inform resource allocation decisions for Guard units across the galaxy. How few rations could sustain a fighting force? How crowded could barracks become before discipline collapsed? How long could men fight without hope before they simply stopped fighting? These were the questions Firebase Gehenna was designed to answer, and we were providing the data with our lives. I wanted to be wrong. I wanted this to be paranoid delusion brought on by heat and exhaustion. But as I started looking for evidence, I found it everywhere. The medical inspections that weren't checking for disease but measuring our deterioration. The supply manifests that followed mathematical models rather than actual need. The commissariat reports that documented behavioral changes rather than disciplinary infractions. Even the greenskin attacks seemed suspiciously regular, as if they were being allowed to reach us in measured doses to maintain a consistent stress level. And that designation on our identification tags CCPROTOCOLACTIVE. I finally found a reference to it in a damaged data slate I recovered from the commissariat office during a fire suppression operation. The slate was mostly corrupted, but I managed to extract fragments of text, enough to understand. CC stood for Controlled Conditions. We were part of Protocol Omega-7 Null, a long-term study initiated by the Departamento Monitorum to establish baseline survival parameters for Guard forces operating in extreme environments. Firebase Gehenna was one of dozens of similar installations across Armageddon, each running slightly different protocols, each measuring different variables. We had been selected because we were expendable. Not expendable in the way all Guardsmen are expendable, that's just the nature of Imperial military service. We were specifically chosen because our loss would create no ripples, no complications. We were from hive worlds that produced millions of recruits. We had no powerful family connections, no political patrons who might ask awkward questions. We had been sifted from the vast tide of humanity flowing into the Imperial Guard and set aside for this purpose. We were meant to die here. But we were meant to die slowly, measurably, in ways that would teach the Imperium how to more efficiently kill other Guardsmen in the future. I should have kept this knowledge to myself. Should have buried it along with all my other suppressed horrors and focused on surviving. But I was angry. Angrier than I'd ever been. Angrier than the day I'd watched my home hive burn during a heretic uprising. Angrier than my first combat when I'd seen half my squad torn apart by orc choppers. This was different. This wasn't the random cruelty of war. This was deliberate, calculated. Our suffering had been planned by men sitting in comfortable offices light years away, men who would never smell the ash or feel the heat or watch their friends die for data. I told the others. Not everyone. I wasn't suicidal, but the men I trusted. Lessig, Vrel, a few others who'd noticed the same patterns, who'd been harboring the same suspicions. We met in the shadows during the night watch, speaking in whispers, sharing our evidence and our rage. What do we do? Lessig asked. We can't fight the Imperium. We can't run. There's nowhere to go on Armageddon. We stop cooperating, Vrel suggested. We stop providing the data they want, refuse the medical inspections, alter our reports, sabotage their experiment. But I knew that wouldn't work. The Imperium's response to non-cooperation was simple and absolute: execution. If we rebelled, even passively, the commissariat would simply liquidate us, and request new subjects. Our deaths would be recorded as combat losses or equipment failures or any of 100 other euphemisms the administratum used to hide inconvenient truths. "We survive," I said finally. "We survive better than they expect. We prove that we are more than their data points. We become the variable that breaks their model." It was a thin hope, but it was the only one we had. So, we started fighting back in the only way available to us. We became perfect soldiers. We exceeded every metric, surpassed every expectation. When they reduced our rations, we maintained our combat effectiveness through scavenged supplies and careful energy management. When they contracted our space, we adapted our defensive positions and increased our efficiency. When they sent the greenskins against us, we killed them with a precision and coordination that should have been impossible for men in our condition. We became what the Imperium pretended we were, the Emperor's finest, unbreakable in our devotion, relentless in our duty. But we did it with full knowledge that it was a lie. We did it because it was the only revenge available to us to survive so well that we ruined their data, their models, their carefully constructed experiment. For a while, it worked. Our casualty rates dropped. Our combat performance improved. The medical teams that came through looked increasingly confused by our vitals, which showed men who should have been broken operating at near-peak efficiency. The supply officers couldn't explain how we were maintaining our equipment on inadequate requisitions. The intelligence analysts reported behavioral patterns that didn't match their psychological projections. We were becoming anomalous. And in the Imperium's vast bureaucratic machine, anomalies are problems that need to be resolved. The resolution came in the form of Colonel Drask. He arrived without warning, descended from orbit in a Valkyrie gunship that bore the seal of the Officio Prefectus. He was tall, augmented, his left arm replaced with a mechanical prosthetic that hummed with barely contained power. His uniform was immaculate despite the ash. His face was hard, and his eyes held the cold certainty of a man who'd never questioned an order in his life. He assembled us in the Firebase courtyard, all 110 of us standing at attention in the baking heat. The automated gun servitors tracked us from the walls, a reminder that any sign of disorder would be met with immediate lethal force. "I am here," Drask announced, his voice amplified by voxcasters, "because you have become inefficient. Your survival rates exceed projected parameters. Your resource utilization demonstrates non-standard adaptations. Your behavioral patterns suggest unauthorized cooperation and possibly seditious communication." He paced before us, his mechanical arm clicking with each step. "You were selected for this posting because you were deemed optimal subjects for long-term stress analysis. Your purpose is not victory. Your purpose is data. You are contributing to the Imperium's understanding of human limitations, and through your suffering, you are serving the Emperor more effectively than you ever could through combat alone." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. We stood like statues while Drask laid bare the truth we'd already discovered. "However," he continued, "your recent performance suggests that you have become aware of your purpose and are attempting to subvert it. This is unacceptable. The integrity of Protocol Omega-7 Null must be maintained. Corrections will be implemented." The corrections began that night. Drask brought with him a detachment of commissariat enforcers, hard men selected for their ability to implement difficult orders without question. They moved through the firebase systematically, identifying the men they considered ringleaders based on criteria we couldn't determine. Some selections seemed random, others were clearly targeted. Vrel was the first. They took him from his bunk in the middle of the night, dragged him to the courtyard, and executed him by firing squad. His crime, according to the charges read aloud by Drask, was unauthorized measurement of fortress dimensions and dissemination of subversive observations. They left his body in the courtyard for 3 days as an example, the ash slowly covering him like a burial shroud. Lessig was next. Then Corporal then men I didn't know well but who I'd seen questioning supplies or altering reports. Drask was purging the variables, eliminating the elements that had disrupted his study. He was resetting the experiment, but he made a mistake. He assumed that fear would return us to compliance, that watching our comrades die would break whatever resistance we'd built. He didn't understand that we'd already been broken, that we'd already passed through fear into something else entirely. He didn't understand that men with nothing to lose are the most dangerous men of all. The uprising wasn't planned. There was no coordination, no secret meeting where we plotted rebellion. It simply happened, sparked by a moment of collective rage that ignited like promethium in oxygen. They came for me on the 7th night of the purge. I was ready. I'd been ready since Vrel died. When the enforcers entered the barracks, I didn't go quietly. I fought. And when I fought, others joined me. Suddenly the barracks erupted in violence, guardsmen against enforcers, fists against shock mauls, desperation against training. We killed 3 of them before they retreated, leaving their corpses behind. In that moment of stunned silence, looking at the bodies of Imperial enforcers lying in our own blood and theirs, we crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. We were no longer guardsmen. We were traitors, rebels, dead men, who just hadn't stopped breathing yet. The fortress erupted into chaos. Half the men joined the uprising, seeing no alternative to eventual execution. The other half remained loyal to the Imperium, either from genuine faith or from belief that loyalty was their only chance at survival. The barracks became a battleground, guardsmen fighting guardsmen, while Drask sealed himself in the command center and called for orbital support. The fighting was brutal and brief. We had numbers, but they had position and better weapons. The automated gun servitors, reprogrammed by Drask's tech priest, turned on us, their heavy bolters cutting down men who trusted those defenses to protect them. The chapel became a slaughterhouse as loyalists barricaded themselves inside, and we tried to breach it. The armory changed hands 3 times, each transition marked by corpses. I survived the first hour through luck and desperation. I fought men I'd served beside for years, men whose names I knew, whose families I'd heard about during long nights on watch. I killed 3 of them. I watched 5 more die around me, torn apart by bolt rounds or burned by flamers. The ash turned to mud with blood, and still we fought, because fighting was all we had left. By dawn, it was over. Of the 110 men who'd been stationed at Firebase Gehenna, 32 remained. The rest were dead or dying, sprawled across the fortress in various states of dismemberment. The walls we'd defended so fiercely were now our tomb, the automated defenses ensuring that none of us could escape into the ash wastes. Drask's voice echoed from voxcasters throughout the firebase. You have proven yourselves traitors to the Imperium. You have rejected the Emperor's will and embraced damnation, but your deaths will still serve. Orbital bombardment has been authorized. In 1 hour, this installation will be sterilized. Your betrayal will be recorded. Your names will be struck from Imperial records. You will be forgotten, as you deserve. 1 hour, 60 minutes to live. For most of the survivors, that announcement broke whatever hope remained. Some wept, some prayed, some simply sat in the ash and waited for the end. But a few of us 7 men, led by me, though I'm not sure I deserve to lead, decided we would not go quietly into that extinction. The command center was sealed, but it wasn't impregnable. We'd defended this fortress for years. We knew its weaknesses. We gathered what weapons remained, pooled our explosives, and made our final assault. Not to escape was impossible, but to kill Drask. To ensure that the man who'd turned our suffering into data died beside us. The assault was suicide, and we knew it. The command center's approaches were killing zones, covered by servitor guns and automated turrets. We lost 2 men in the first hallway, torn apart by crossfire. Another died breaching the reinforced door, his body absorbing the blast that cleared our path. But we pushed forward, driven by rage that exceeded any concern for survival. We found Drask in the command center, surrounded by cogitator banks and data slates, calmly recording his final observations on the uprising. He looked up as we entered, showing no fear. His mechanical arm powered up, weapon systems activating. "Fascinating," he said. "Even in the face of certain death, you maintain aggression. The human capacity for spite is truly remarkable. This data will be invaluable." I shot him. 3 last bolts to the chest, burning through his uniform and into flesh. He staggered, but didn't fall, his augmented physiology keeping him upright. His arm weapon discharged, killing the man beside me. We rushed him together, 4 guardsmen against 1 colonel, and bore him down through weight of numbers. Dying, his blood pooling beneath him, Drask smiled. "You've only proven the hypothesis," he whispered. "Humans pushed to extremity become animals. Predictable. Quantifiable. Thank you for the data." I broke his neck with my bare hands, feeling the augmetic snap beneath my grip. But even as I killed him, I knew he was right. We'd become exactly what he expected. Our rebellion had been measured, recorded, analyzed. Even in death, we served the experiment. The orbital bombardment began with the thunder of descent. We felt the first impacts through the fortress walls. Massive kinetic strikes that shook the very foundation of Firebase Gehenna. The remaining 4 of us made our way to the chapel, the only structure that might offer any shelter, however brief. We sat among the bodies of our former comrades, in the ash and blood, and waited for the end. Nobody spoke. There was nothing left to say. Outside, the bombardment intensified, turning the world into a furnace of explosive force. The walls that had contracted around us, that had made us prisoners in our own defense, began to crack and crumble. I thought about Mordessa, my home world. I tried to remember my family, my life before the Guard, but those memories seemed impossibly distant, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. All I could recall with clarity was ash and heat, and the weight of knowing that our suffering had been deliberate. The bombardment reached the chapel. The roof collapsed, crushing one of my companions instantly. The walls buckled inward. I felt the heat intensify beyond anything I'd experienced, felt my skin begin to blister and burn. But even through that agony, I held on to consciousness long enough to think one final thought. They'll never know the truth. The records will say we died fighting greenskins, or that we were killed by enemy bombardment, or that the firebase was lost to equipment failure. The Imperium will erase what happened here, bury it in classifications and sealed files. Firebase Gehenna will become another forgotten footnote in the endless war for Armageddon, and will be statistics in someone's efficiency report. But I know. In these final seconds, I know what they did to us. I know that we were murdered not by Xenos or heretics but by our own people, by the vast machine that we'd given our lives to serve. I know that the Imperium of man, in its pursuit of efficiency and optimization, has become something that consumes its own children for data points and projected survival curves. I know, and knowing is the only revenge I'll ever have. The ceiling came down in a cascade of burning rockcrete. I closed my eyes and felt the impact, felt bones shatter and organs rupture. But my mind remained active for impossible seconds more, neurons firing in final desperation. And in that extended moment I had a vision. I saw Firebase Gehenna from above, saw it reduced to rubble and ash, and beyond it I saw other firebases, hundreds of them, dotting the landscape of Armageddon, each one a laboratory, each one filled with men like me, slowly dying for data. And beyond Armageddon, I saw other worlds, other conflicts, all feeding into the same vast network of measurement and analysis. The entire Imperial Guard, I realized, was an experiment. Millions of men dying not to win wars but to teach the Imperium how to more efficiently sacrifice millions more. We are all subjects, all prisoners, all fuel for the machine. And the machine is eternal. Darkness came then, merciful and absolute. The pain ended, the heat ended, the awareness that had been Trooper Venko Maris fragmented and dispersed, adding my atoms to the ash that covers everything on this throne-forsaken world. But before the final extinction, before consciousness dissolved entirely, I managed one last act of defiance. This journal, wrapped in its oilcloth, hidden in the deepest part of my footlocker which I'd secured in the chapel's armored reliquary, might survive the bombardment. Someone might find it someday. Someone might read these words and understand what was done here. Maybe that someone will be another guardsman, stationed at another firebase, slowly realizing that their suffering is being measured and catalogued. Maybe they'll recognize the patterns I've described. Maybe they'll understand that they're not fighting a war. They're feeding a system that devours human lives and converts them into metrics. Or maybe this journal will never be found. Maybe it's already been vaporized. And these words I'm writing exist only in my dying imagination, a comforting fiction that lets me believe my death might mean something beyond a data point in Protocol Omega-7 null. Either way, I've done what I can. I've left a record. I've testified to the truth of Firebase Gehenna and the hell of being posted to Armageddon. I've documented how the Imperium treats its soldiers not as men but as resources to be optimally consumed. Let someone else decide if that matters. Let someone else carry this rage forward. Let someone else. The journal entry ends there, the final letters barely legible, the oilcloth stained with what might be blood or might be simple moisture. The reliquary was recovered 6 months after the destruction of Firebase Gehenna by a salvage team searching for intact equipment. The journal was filed with other personal effects, catalogued, and processed through standard Departamento Munitorum protocols. It was read by 3 different officials, each of whom noted its contents in their reports. The first official classified the document as subversive literature recommend destruction. The second official noted psychological deterioration under combat stress, typical delusional patterns. The third official, an Adeptus Administratum analyst named Scrivener Vouth, filed it under anecdotal records combat stress psychosis and assigned it archival designation CCOMEGA7NULLTESTIMONY847. Scrivener Vouth added a personal notation to the file, visible only to those with appropriate clearance. Subject demonstrates classic paranoid ideation resulting from prolonged exposure to hostile environment. No evidence of protocol breach. Data from Firebase Gehenna remains valid and has been incorporated into updated survival parameter models. Recommend continuation of controlled condition testing at remaining sites. Human testimony is unreliable. Metrics are truth. The journal was sealed in the archives of Hive Infernus, where it remains to this day. One document among billions, a voice crying out from ash and darkness that nobody will ever hear. And across Armageddon, at hundreds of identical firebases, Guardsmen continue to serve. They endure the heat and the ash and the grinding horror of endless war. They follow their orders. They die in their assigned positions. They provide data. The experiment continues. The machine is fed. The Emperor, somewhere in his unknowable wisdom, protects.